Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk mostly about a guy named Jacques Louis David. But before we get into him, I wanted to talk a little bit about how propaganda was used throughout the whole entire French Revolution. You've heard of some examples of that already, whether it be Napoleon and his use of propaganda to spread his fame, or from Jean-Paul Marat and his newspaper, The Friend of the People, that spread many of the attitudes of the revolutionaries, or of the political cartoons that helped to spur and carry on the revolution. So, propaganda, as you probably know, the definition's there. The idea is that it's supposed to influence what people do in order to benefit the sponsor, who is the person who's making it. It's trying to persuade you to do something or feel a certain way. We usually see propaganda every day when we're watching television commercials, whether it be a political ad or trying to get you to buy something that this is what the cool people buy, or this candidate is the best, or the candidate running against them is the worst. Newspapers played a huge role in the French Revolution. There were only 4 papers in Paris before the French Revolution because the freedom of the press was severely limited. But by 1791, there were over 150 newspapers in Paris. So this is during the Revolution. Freedom of speech and the freedom of the press are going to explode. It actually started with the call for the Estates General in order to get cahiers which had proper representation of the people. King Louis freed up the press a bit, which was probably a mistake looking back, because now the ideas that had previously been whispered in back rooms were now out there for everyone to read. The Enlightenment ideas that had been talked about in salons were now more out in the open, and they're going to incite violence against the tyranny, such as the attack on the Bastille, and also start to have people think that it's okay to say bad things against the king or the monarchy in general. And some of the most famous works were the one mentioned by Marat, and also another one by a guy named Brissot. And Marat was considered influential in many of the major events of the French Revolution, including the Women's March, the September massacres. He was one who put out lists of people who he thought should be executed who weren't loyal to the revolution. Political cartoons were huge. The one that we looked at in class was a classic representation of what French society was leading up to the revolution and why people felt that the Third Estate needed to rebel. And you can see another version of that here. This would just be a little bit later in the process, where the First and Second Estate are running from the Third Estate when they realize they're throwing off their chains, picking up a gun. The cartoon up in the top right was one that was done by England, looking at the craziness of the French Revolution and how it had gotten out of hand, kind of poking fun at the French. And political cartoons were a good tool because anyone could access them. Jacques Louis David is going to become the top propagandist of the French Revolution. He's going to be used to further the ideas of the French Revolution, mostly visually, but he's going to be involved in a lot of the actual incidents in the French Revolution as well. You can take a look. There's a video called The Power of Art on Jacques Louis David. It analyzes his art and his life. That's interesting if you're into that sort of thing. David had suffered some adversity as a young person. At 9 years old, his father was killed in a duel. He received a good education, but he wasn't really good at school. He liked to draw and sketch rather than do his work. His uncle wanted to use this. His uncle was fairly wealthy, who he went to stay with after his father was killed. And he wanted to put this drawing to good use where he could make a decent living, so he wanted him to be an architect. And David said, no, I want to be an artist. So his uncle wanted him to at least be trained by the best if he was going to be an artist. So he studied under Boucher. Now, if you remember Boucher, he was the Rococo artist, the most famous one of the time period, and painted paintings such as that, very soft and elegant paintings of people lounging, doing everyday things. David wasn't happy with the style of Boucher, so he moved on to a different teacher and studied at the Royal Academy, someone who was more of his style. David favored people like Raphael and the more realistic paintings that he did. There was a very prestigious scholarship called the Prix de Rome that was given out every year, and the prize was a scholarship to the French Academy in Rome, Rome was the heart of the Renaissance and where all the great artists had been trained. And so David really wanted to win this. He entered every year. He always felt that his painting was the best, but he felt that politics led to him not being selected. He finally won after 5 attempts, and then he went and studied with Vienne and studied the Italian masters. Again, his favorite was Raphael, and you probably remember his painting, The School of Athens, which is probably his most famous work. This is one of his early works, Diana and Apollo piercing Niobe's children with their arrows. A pretty tragic story. Niobe bragged about how she was the greatest mother, greater than Diana because she had many children. And so, as the gods did back then, the Diana and Apollo came down and killed her children and then her husband as well. David won the contest with the Prix de Rome with this painting, and Antiochus and Stratonice in 1774. This is another bizarre story from ancient Greece where the son is falling terribly ill and his father doesn't know why, and he gets a prophet basically to explain to him, what can I do to save my son? I'll do anything to save my son. And it turns out that his son was in love with the king's wife, who was his stepmother. And so the king nobly, I guess, stepped aside and allowed his son to marry his wife in order to heal him and to make sure that he didn't die. When David came back from Rome, he was a member of the Royal Academy, which is a prestigious art group. He had paintings exhibited at the Salon, which was the biggest art show in the Western world, and he became the most popular painter of the era. He's going to start a whole new way of painting called the neoclassical. Neoclassical, if you look at the word, it means new, old. He chose mostly Greek and Roman themes. That's the classic part of it, and it's a moment frozen in time. It's almost like today, if we took a picture of something, David was looking, what would this look like as a picture? Tried to make it as realistic as possible. Picked a dramatic moment in history, and he interpreted it. In many Greek and Roman stories, I'm not going to spend too much time telling you about all of them, but I'll give you a snippet of each of these stories because they were all very relatable to the French Revolution. David had a lot of hidden meaning in his art, and he would use these classical ideas, again, especially before the freedom of the press really came about. He would use these kind of what we would think about obscure stories from Greece and Rome, but in their teaching, anyone who was educated knew the history of Greece and Rome as well as they knew their own. So they weren't obscure stories to them. So some of these ideas were immediately seized upon and seen to be a bit controversial, that they were speaking out against the monarchy or promoting a republic and ideas like that. So one of these is a picture of the Belisarius receiving arms. Belisarius was Justinian's greatest general. Justinian was one of the late Roman emperors. He was actually a Byzantine emperor, we call him today. But Belisarius was an incredibly talented general for him, and he defeated everyone. He did it mostly through kind of shady negotiations. He would go to one country and he would say to them, hey, this other country is going to attack you. And they asked us to help them, but we're not going to because you're our allies. And then he would go to another country and say the exact same thing. Pretty soon those countries would fight. Belisarius and his men would go in and kind of clean up the end and conquer them both. Well, eventually Belisarius got too powerful for Justinian's liking, and Justinian decided that he was a threat, that he had the loyalty of the army. He obviously knew how to backstab and use dirty tricks. So Justinian set him up in a battle that he couldn't win, sent him in against impossible odds, notified the enemy that he was coming, And when Belisarius lost that battle, Justinian accused him of cowardice and had him blinded and exiled from his empire. This is David's portrayal of what it would look like if one of Belisarius's old soldiers came across him begging in the streets. And the connection to this was that there had been a French general in the French and Indian War. His name was General Louie Tollendal, and he was pretty much singled out by Louis XV as being blamed for the French losing the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, and he was executed for dereliction of duty and for cowardice. And so many people felt that it was the king blaming him on a war that he didn't manage well and shouldn't have gotten into, and that this execution of Tollendal was a farce. And so this painting of Belisarius, people made that connection pretty quick. Okay, so here's another David painting that became very famous called The Oath of Horatii. There's a couple things in here that are artistically impressive, that things that hadn't been done before, such as the three main characters lined up in a row like this. That was something that hadn't been seen before in a major artwork. Also, notice the way that he uses the light, the focus not only on the father here, but also on the women in the background. A little bit about the story. This was supposedly took place in the early days of Rome, where they were battling with the colonies in the seven hills around them, or the groups in the seven hills around them. This was a fight against one of those groups, where instead of risking the whole army of both sides, they decided that the three sons of the ruler of Rome were going to fight the three sons of the ruler of the other area. This is them taking an oath to their country, to the Republic, the Roman Republic at that time, and the oath was to die to save the Roman Republic. And so one of the other side stories here is that one of these women back here, not only they are the sisters of these guys, but one of them is not only the sister, but also married to one of the men on the other side. So no matter what happens, she's going to lose. So David shows a bit of that suffering that's going to happen to the innocents in war, and you'll see that as a theme throughout some of his paintings. But again, just an amazing piece of art, and it shows that idea of the Republic, which was a little bit of an Enlightenment idea that was being shown in this painting again, and something that was a bit controversial. There's a political cartoon kind of based after that, looking at the people who are still pledging an oath to the old king are kind of out of date and old. The death of Socrates, if you know about Socrates, he considered himself a teacher, but the way that he taught was by asking questions. This is a depiction of his death, which he was sentenced to die by drinking poisoned hemlock. And this is as it was depicted in Plato's stories about him. The idea here is talking about freedom of speech. And in 1787, you notice it's the time when the Enlightenment ideas are starting to develop. People are starting to talk about having freedom of speech. It was shortly after the time when Voltaire had been kicked out of France and that Diderot had been arrested for their ideas. So this kind of hidden idea here is that Socrates was killed for asking questions and causing the youth to ask questions. He questioned, like, why is democracy the greatest form of government, and questioned the religion of the Greeks as well. That they're, how do we know that there are gods? And there was this fear that he was going to anger the gods and they were going to come back and get them, that also that he was undermining the government. So this was a painting that was very controversial at the time, because it was showing that idea of freedom of speech and the ability to question the government. And everyone considered Socrates a hero in history. As a matter of fact, his accusers were all suffered horrible deaths. One was hounded and committed suicide. Another one was stoned in the streets. So there was a bad connotation with the sentence given to Socrates of death. for simply asking questions. This is a portrait of Antoine Lavoisier. He was executed in the guillotine. You may remember him from the guillotine stories. He's the one who supposedly blinked after he was executed. This was another high-quality painting done by David, but it was unable to be displayed because of Lavoisier's connection with the ideas of the revolution and the Jacobins, which in 1789 were a developing group opposed to the king, the ideas of the king. This one's a really long story. Brutus had his sons killed because he found out they were conspiring with the enemy. The idea here is that idea of country before individuals, country before family even. And the other theme here is the collateral damage. You can see that Brutus is here. He made the decision to kill his sons. Their bodies are coming in. He's in the dark, which was another kind of new idea, to have the main character of a painting sitting in the dark in the shadows, while David's kind of focusing more on the suffering of the mother and the siblings and the wife of his son who were mourning his death. So that idea that if you're going to go through with this revolution, there's going to be some unintended consequences. There's going to be victims that aren't necessarily involved in innocent victims. So really making that connection to what was happening in France again with an old idea from Rome. This is a tennis court oath. I told a story about this, how it continued to change. Even the man who gave the oath, John Sylvain Bailey, was eventually beheaded by the guillotine because he wasn't considered to be radical enough to go along with the later ideas of the revolution. So David was never able to finish and post this painting as a true tribute to the revolution because of the people that were in it ended up being considered not to be such fans of the revolution or friends of the revolution. David was also involved within the revolution. He wasn't just an artist and head propaganda person. He was a Jacobin. He was a big supporter of the revolution. He was a member of the Committee of Public Safety. He was very close with Robespierre and Marat. He was selected as a member of the National Convention, and he even voted for executing the king. As I said, he was on the Committee of Public Safety as well. And his propaganda is going to help further the Reign of Terror, and it's going to help further the rise of Robespierre. He's going to be the one who arranges the funeral of Marat into a big piece of propaganda that turns him into a martyr. And this is his painting of Marat, that will turn him into a martyr. This is a painting that was, even at David's funeral, not allowed to be displayed because of the controversy that it's going to bring throughout history. After Marat was killed, David made this painting of him. It was hung up in the National Convention, and he was honored almost as a saint. And people are going to look at that and remember, and many people are going to think that this spurs some of the violence of the revolution. On the other side of the National Convention was this picture of Barra. Barra was a young boy who was supposedly killed by counter-revolutionaries when he declared his loyalty to the revolution instead of loyalty to the king. This supposedly happened in the Vendée, which was the very violent area, if you remember, Napoleon refused to go to. And this was a story that was told. The story of Barra was told in schools to young kids to get them to support the revolution and the revolutionaries. At the end of the revolution, David was somewhat responsible for the downfall of Robespierre as well. He arranged for this thing called the Cult of the Supreme Being, this festival for that. And this was where Robespierre didn't want a total godless society. So he had this cult to the Supreme Being, and at the top of it was this giant paper mache mountain that Robespierre came out of the top, dressed up almost like a god. And people thought that he'd really kind of gone over the top and had lost it and felt a bit too much of himself. And so it's one of the things that led to his downfall. People really started to whisper about him after that. When Robespierre was arrested, so was David after Robespierre's execution. David's wife, however, was still kind of in with the people who were in control. She had a lot of influence, and she enabled him to avoid execution. He was in prison for 2 years, He painted something called the Intervention of the Sabine Women, which you'll see on the next slide. And this painting is going to bring him to the attention of Napoleon. This painting, the Intervention of the Sabine Women, is kind of his call for peace. What happened was the Sabines were one of the neighboring areas around Rome again, and the Romans, when they were settled, only had men. And in order to further their civilization, they wanted women. So they actually went and stole the Sabine women from the Sabines and brought them back and had children with them, made them their wives. And then the Sabines, after that attack, were injured for a while and couldn't rally an army until a couple years later, when they came back to fight the Romans to bring back the women that had been stolen. The women actually jumped out in the middle of the battle with their children and did not want their fathers and their brothers to kill the people who are now the fathers of their children and their husbands. So the women stopped the battle, and this was considered to be David's kind of plea for peace in France to get on with life past the revolution. And Napoleon saw this painting and realized that he could really use David's talents to help him in his rise to power. So Napoleon hired David to paint many paintings of him. The most famous painting of Napoleon is this one here of him on the horse crossing the Alps. And Napoleon didn't actually pose for this. He said, "Paint me calmly on a rearing horse," was the directions that he gave David. And there's some subtle things in here that Napoleon really loved. If you look at the stones at the bottom, it shows Charlemagne is the bottom one, and then Hannibal, who also crossed the Alps, and then Bonaparte at the top above all of these great generals and military figures. So Napoleon really liked the fact that David elevated him to this level. David also painted the coronation of Napoleon, which we talked about in the Napoleon episode. And this is another one. You can notice the kind of Roman garb and salutes that are here still attribute to his neoclassical painting style in these, what are modern day events that he is painting. This one is still in the Palace at Versailles today, or the Louvre. One of his later paintings was called Leonidas at Thermopylae. This was in 1814, right as Napoleon had been defeated by the Russians, or had his retreat from Russia, and he was headed into exile, and then was on his 100 days. And David put this painting out there, and Napoleon didn't like it. He saw the connection between the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, who made this great heroic stand but were eventually slaughtered. He saw the comparison that David was making to the situation that he was in, where he may make a heroic stand and a heroic last fight, but Napoleon was destined to lose. After Napoleon, David was offered to be the court painter of King Louis XVIII, and amnesty for being involved in the revolution and being involved with Napoleon, who had overthrown him again when he came back with the 100 days. David turned it down, and he moved to Brussels, where he's going to live out his life and have a couple more paintings. Mars being disarmed by Venus and the Three Graces is his last masterpiece. And he was run over by a carriage in 1825 at 77 years old, and he died. This is Mars being disarmed by Venus and the Three Graces. As you can see, even in his later years, his artistic abilities were still amazing. I encourage you to look at some of his other works, to research David and check out his artwork. Also to think about what impact did he have on the revolution, or on France during the revolution and after. And I'm going to ask you to compare his impact with that of Napoleon's.